The stories. Why this bridge changed everything forever. The state report said the bridge failure was an accident, but the dispatch audio tells a different story. What happened on that span turned a quiet county into a place that never felt normal again. Tobin Rusk was 38, and he worked as a road inspector for a small transportation district. He drove a white pickup, carried a thick binder, and treated every complaint like it mattered. On a clear morning in late fall, he headed toward an old steel truss bridge outside a riverside town. The plan was simple. He would photograph rust spots and sign off on a routine maintenance note. The bridge was called Latham's Span on maps, though locals just called it the River Bridge. Tobin arrived before noon, and he noticed something that did not fit the usual pattern. Fresh orange cones sat near the north shoulder, but no crew truck was parked nearby. A hand-painted board leaned against the rail, and the warning looked rushed and uneven. It said, "Do not stop on bridge," and the letters were thick like they were done in panic. Tobin parked off the approach, and he walked the deck with his camera ready. Halfway across, he found a strip of new asphalt that cut straight across two lanes. It was not wide, but it was too clean, like someone patched a scar in the dark. He crouched near the patch, and he saw a faint line where the surface had been cut. Under the tar smell, there was another odor, sharp and metallic, like hot wiring insulation. Tobin took photos, then he pressed his knuckles to the asphalt to feel for warmth. It was cool, which meant the patch was not from last night like the cones suggested. A car passed behind him, and the driver slowed, then accelerated hard without looking. Tobin stood up, and he realized there were no pedestrians, no fishing gear, no stopped traffic. The bridge felt avoided, like the whole county agreed to keep moving. Back at his truck, Tobin opened his binder and reviewed the last inspection notes. The prior entry, dated 2 months earlier, mentioned only paint flaking and minor bolt corrosion. There was no note about any patch and no mention of cones, boards, or emergency repairs. He called the district office, and the receptionist said no work order was scheduled there. Tobin asked about unplanned repairs, and she said none were approved that week. He thanked her, then he called the county dispatch non-emergency line for any recent incidents. The dispatcher hesitated, then said there had been a call, but the log was restricted. Tobin drove to the county building, and he signed a form to request older audio. He had done this before after crashes, so the clerk recognized his face and his patience. She printed a receipt, then she said the archive could take a few days to release files. Tobin did not argue, but he asked if the clerk could at least confirm the date. She leaned closer and whispered a date, then wrote it on a sticky note for him. It was from the previous weekend, which made no sense for a bridge with no visible damage. Tobin left with a bad feeling, and he drove straight to the nearest gas station by the river. An older man behind the counter watched Tobin's reflective vest and the camera on his seat. Tobin bought coffee, then asked if anyone had been working on the bridge recently. The man said no crews, but he said he heard sirens on Saturday night near the water. He added that 2 sheriff units blocked the south approach for almost an hour. Tobin asked why, and the man shrugged and said it looked like a training exercise. That word stuck because the sheriff department did not train on that bridge in winter. Tobin asked if anyone filmed it, and the man pointed at a small sign about security cameras. The gas station had a camera facing the road, but it only held footage for a short window. Tobin asked the manager, and she agreed to review the Saturday night clip with him. They stood in a back office, and the monitor showed a black SUV stopping near the bridge. 2 vehicles arrived behind it, both unmarked, and their lights flashed once, then went dark. A man in a hood walked toward the bridge with something long, carried like a pipe. Another person dragged a heavy bag, and it sagged like it held wet sand. The footage was grainy, but the timing matched the sticky note date from the clerk. Tobin asked the manager to save the clip, and she said she could export it to a drive. He gave her a fresh one from his glove box. Then he wrote his phone number on tape. As he left, a woman pumping gas stared at him. Then she looked away too fast. Tobin approached her carefully, and he asked if she lived nearby or crossed the bridge often. She said she used to, but she stopped after hearing a strange sound at night. Tobin asked what sound, and she said it was a deep thump, followed by a light ringing. She added that the river carried sound, and it felt like it came from under the deck. Tobin returned to the bridge at dusk, and he parked where he could see the underside. The water was low, and the concrete pier bases were exposed in muddy brown light. He climbed down the bank and he aimed a flashlight at the beams under the patch area. Most of the steel looked old but stable, with layers of paint and rust as expected. Then he saw a newer metal plate bolted over a joint, and the bolts looked mismatched. One bolt head was bright, like it had been installed recently with a different supplier. Tobin photographed it, then he ran his finger along the plate edge and felt fresh sealant. He called his supervisor, but the call went to voicemail and Tobin left a short message. He said the bridge had an undocumented patch, plus new hardware that did not match inventory. He asked for a second inspector the next morning, then he returned to his truck to write. While he wrote, headlights approached, then stopped behind him without passing. Tobin looked in his mirror, and a dark pickup sat there with its engine idling. The driver did not honk and did not pull around, just waited like a patient shadow. Tobin started his truck, and the pickup backed up, then turned away toward town. That night, Tobin went home and opened his laptop to organize the day's files. He labeled each photo with timestamps, and he wrote a summary for the district server. Before sending it, he listened to his voicemail, and there was a new message from a blocked number. A man's voice said, "Stop looking at that bridge." Then the call ended with a click. Tobin saved the voicemail, then he forwarded it to his work email for documentation. He barely slept because the warning felt personal, and it arrived too soon to be random. The next morning, Tobin went to the archive office the clerk had mentioned. He signed another form, and after a long wait, a technician handed him a file on a disk. The technician said some parts were redacted, but the main dispatch portion was intact. Tobin drove to a quiet parking lot, and he played the audio through his car speakers. At first, it sounded normal, with a caller reporting a stalled vehicle near the bridge approach. Then, a second voice cut in, low and hurried, asking for units to switch channels. A few seconds later, someone said, "Keep traffic moving. Nobody stops on that deck." The audio did not name a suspect, but it contained a phrase Tobin could not ignore. The dispatcher said, "Do not notify fire," which was the opposite of standard procedure. Then a deputy said, "We need the portable welder," and the dispatcher repeated the request. A portable welder was not part of a normal traffic stop, and it was not road district gear. The last clear line was a deputy saying, "Bag is in the river," followed by static. Tobin sat still, and he replayed that line 3 times, trying to hear it differently. He could not, and the words made his stomach tighten like a fist. Tobin drove back to the bridge with a plan, and he brought a magnet, chalk, and a tape measure. He marked the plate position under the deck, then he measured the bolt spacing carefully. The pattern did not match any approved retrofit kit, and the plate covered something important. Near one edge, he saw a thin scorch mark on the beam, like heat had touched bare steel. Tobin scraped gently with a screwdriver, and a small flake lifted, showing fresher metal beneath. He photographed that too, then he stepped back and noticed a cable tie dangling near the joint. It was new plastic, cut clean, and it did not belong on a bridge built decades ago. A fisherman on the bank watched Tobin work and finally walked closer with cautious steps. He said he had seen men on the bridge at night, and they did not look like road workers. Tobin asked what they did, and the fisherman said they carried lights and a heavy toolbox. He added that they tossed something into the river, then one of them sprayed paint on the deck. Tobin asked what color, and the fisherman said it looked like quick black paint, not road tar. Tobin thanked him, then asked if he had a phone video, and the fisherman shook his head. He said his phone was old, and he did not want trouble with law enforcement. Tobin went to a marine supply shop and rented a small inspection camera on a flexible pole. The clerk showed him how to record, and Tobin paid in cash and kept the receipt. He returned to the bridge in late afternoon, when traffic was light and the light was steady. From the pier access point, he guided the camera toward the underside seam near the plate. The screen showed bolts, then shadows, then a narrow gap where the plate did not seal fully. Inside the gap, something pale reflected. Then the image sharpened into a strip of cloth. It was caught on metal like a snag, and it moved slightly in the river breeze. Tobin pulled the camera back, and he stared at the screen until his eyes burned. Cloth did not explain the weld request, and it did not explain the warning board either. He called a friend who worked in a neighboring county as a structural engineer named Lenora Vance. Lenora was 41, and she consulted on bridge retrofits and failure investigations. Tobin explained the plate, the mismatched bolts, and the dispatch audio without exaggeration. Lenora listened, then said the patch sounded like it covered a cut, not a simple surface repair. She said if someone cut a flange, they might bolt a plate to hide it, but the strength would change. Lenora met Tobin at a diner, and they reviewed photos on Tobin's laptop over cold fries. She pointed at the scorch mark and the tie, then she said someone had worked fast. Tobin played the voicemail, and Lenora's face tightened when she heard the warning. She asked if Tobin had shared the files, and Tobin said he had not sent them yet. Lenora told him to make 2 copies, one for his supervisor and one for a state office. She said local departments sometimes protected their own, even when the truth was ugly. Tobin did not want to believe that, but the audio line about fire still echoed in his head. That evening, Tobin drove to his office and copied everything onto 2 labeled drives. He placed one in a sealed envelope for his supervisor, then he held the second for himself. As he walked to his truck, he noticed the dark pickup again, parked across the lot. The driver did not get out, but the headlights blinked, then went steady like a signal. Tobin got in, locked the doors, and drove the long way home through a busier highway. He did not see the pickup follow, but he felt watched anyway, like the air had eyes. The next day, Tobin's supervisor called him in, and the conversation went strangely flat. The supervisor said the bridge was fine, and the patch was approved through a sheriff request. Tobin asked for the paperwork, and the supervisor said it was classified for public safety. Tobin said bridges did not get classified repairs, and the supervisor told him to drop it. When Tobin pushed back, the supervisor said Tobin could take leave until the next quarter. It was not a threat on paper, but it sounded like a door closing with a soft click. Tobin left the office, and he drove straight to the state transportation field office downtown. At the state office, Tobin met an intake officer who asked careful questions and took notes. Tobin gave the second drive, and he described the plate, the audio, and the gas station footage. The officer did not promise outcomes, but he said a bridge security review team would look. 2 days later, a state crew arrived at the Latham span with proper trucks and clear markings. Traffic stopped, and inspectors crawled under the deck with bright lights and measuring tools. By afternoon, the state posted a closure notice, and the bridge was shut until further notice. Locals complained, but the closure did not feel like overreaction to Tobin, it felt overdue. A week later, the state report came back with careful language, and it avoided direct blame. It said a critical member had been altered, and a temporary plate hid the modification. It said the alteration reduced safety margins, especially under heavy load and temperature shifts. Tobin asked the state officer what alteration meant, and the officer said someone cut the steel. The officer added that the cut looked deliberate, not corrosion, and tool marks were visible. Tobin thought about the portable welder request and the line about the bag in the river. He realized the bridge had not been repaired to protect drivers. It had been altered to hide something. The twist came from the marine camera clip, which the state team enhanced frame by frame. The pale cloth was not random. It was part of a high-visibility vest, torn on sharp steel. Under the vest, the camera caught a small badge tab, the kind used on county-issued uniforms. That explained the redacted dispatch log, and it explained the order not to notify fire crews. Someone had gone over the rail that night, and the people in charge tried to erase it. They cut steel to remove a mounted camera bracket, then patched and plated to cover the scars. The bag in the river, according to a later witness statement, held the broken camera and the bracket. The state never released the full identity of the person who fell, at least not publicly. Rumors spread anyway, and each version made the town quieter, more suspicious, and more tired. A deputy resigned, then another transferred, and the sheriff faced questions at tense meetings. Tobin kept his head down, but he kept copies of everything in a safe at his brother's house. Months later, a new bridge project was approved, and the old span stayed closed behind fences. People still drove out to look at it, like a scar they could not stop touching. They called it the bridge that changed everything, because after that, nobody trusted easy answers. Tobin stayed in the district, but he stopped believing that paperwork was the whole truth. He learned that structures fail, but so do institutions, and sometimes the cover-up is the real collapse. On certain nights, when wind moved through the river corridor, the old truss still hummed softly. Drivers crossing the new bridge sped up without meaning to, as if the road remembered fear. The Latham span did not just close a route, it opened a question nobody could fully close. It left a town with a new map and an older silence that sat under every conversation. The stories. Night guard, who vanished, reported years later. The missing persons file went cold in a week, then came back to life 7 years later with a single phone call. An archived dispatch note shows the same name logged twice, separated by almost a decade. In late November of 2012, Hollis Crane was 39 and worked nights as a security guard. He was contracted to watch a small warehouse complex on the edge of a mid-sized river city. The job was simple on paper, and it paid better than most overnight shifts in town. Hollis took it because his daughter needed braces, and overtime was suddenly available. The complex had 3 buildings, a fenced lot, and a guard shack near the gate. Hollis drove an older sedan with a cracked dash, and he kept a thermos on the passenger seat. His supervisor gave him a key ring, a radio, and a thin binder labeled Post Orders. The binder included map pages, emergency numbers, and a checklist of hourly patrol points. On his first week, Hollis learned the place had quirks that were not in the binder. One floodlight on the west fence flickered at random, even after an electrician replaced it. A back door on Building 2 stuck and needed a shoulder bump to close fully. Most nights, the river fog rolled in and made the camera feed look like smudged glass. Hollis logged each issue like he was trained, then kept doing his rounds. The last night anyone saw him was a Monday, and the weather report said clear skies. He clocked in at 10, signed the logbook, and checked the camera monitor in the shack. A delivery truck had left earlier, and the lot was quiet except for distant freeway noise. At 10:30, he called his supervisor to confirm a gate code change, and the call lasted 20 seconds. At 11:15, one of the building motion sensors tripped and sent an alert to the shack. The system was old, and false alarms were common, but Hollis still did the routine response. He grabbed a flashlight, a heavy jacket, and his radio, then walked toward Building 2. The camera view showed his figure crossing the lot, and then the image pixelated for a moment. That was the last clear footage that stayed on record. The cameras kept running, but the angle on the back corridor went to static for 6 minutes. When it came back, the corridor was empty, and the back door stood slightly open. The door should have swung shut on its own, and it usually did, even when it stuck. At midnight, Hollis missed a scheduled radio check with the contracted dispatch service. The dispatcher called the shack phone, and it rang without an answer. A second call went the same way. Then the dispatcher phoned the city police non-emergency line. The responding patrol officer found the gate locked and the shack lights on. Inside the shack, Hollis's thermos sat open, and the coffee had gone cold. The logbook lay on the counter, with the last entry half finished and the pen uncapped. His jacket was missing, along with the keyring and the handheld radio. The officer wrote in his report that the chair was pushed back hard, like someone stood up fast. No signs of a struggle were obvious, but the place felt abandoned in a hurry. Officers searched the lot with flashlights and called Hollis's name, getting only echo and river wind. They found his boot prints leading toward Building 2, then fading where gravel turned to packed dirt. Near the back door, they found a small smear of dark grease on the handle. It looked like maintenance grime, but it was fresh, and it did not match the door's usual dirt pattern. A canine unit arrived later and traced a scent line to the west fence, then lost it near the riverbank. The first assumption was that Hollis wandered off, got hurt, or decided to disappear. His family did not buy that, and neither did the detective who took the case. Hollis had recently renewed his lease, and he had a dentist appointment set for that week. His bank account showed normal spending, and his phone did not ping far from the complex. Still, the river was close, and the area had blind spots where cameras did not reach. The investigation moved step by step, like most missing adult cases with limited evidence. Detectives pulled the camera recordings and noted the 6-minute static block in the corridor feed. They collected the shack logbook and photographed the chair position and the open thermos. They interviewed the electrician about the flickering light and learned it had shorted before. They also looked at maintenance records and saw Building 2 had a door latch repaired twice that year. A week later, the file went quiet, and it stayed quiet for years. The security company quietly replaced the cameras and installed a new sensor system. The complex changed tenants, and the guard shack got a new coat of paint. Hollis's family kept his missing poster up at grocery stores, then slowly took them down. The detective rotated out of the unit, and the case became a box in a storage room. In the spring of 2020, a new detective named Price Calder took over cold cases. Price was 44 and worked as a violent crimes detective before shifting to unsolved files. He picked Hollis's case because the original reports were oddly clean, with too few conclusions. The file included a single line that stuck out, a note about the corridor camera going to static. Price asked for the raw footage, and the evidence technician said it still existed on an old drive. The first viewing was disappointing, because the static looked like a simple signal drop. Then Price slowed it down and watched the edges of the frame. Right before the static, a bright band rolled across the screen like a manual interruption. It looked less like weather interference and more like someone unplugged then reconnected a component. Price compared that with the other cameras, looking for any matching drop at the same time. The west fence camera did not glitch at all, and the shack camera stayed steady. That meant the corridor feed failed alone, not as part of a system-wide outage. Price wrote that down, then called a retired technician who had installed the system. The technician reportedly said that specific camera line ran through an exposed junction box near the west fence. Price drove out to the complex with a city inspector and asked to see the old junction route. The box had been replaced years earlier, but the mounting holes in the post were still visible. A new conduit ran cleaner, yet an older cable path had been left in place behind a utility shed. It led toward the riverbank, and the inspector said it was common to abandon runs like that. Price photographed the path and asked the current property manager about any past trespassing issues. The manager mentioned a story, and it sounded like gossip until Price pressed for details. Years back, a fisherman claimed he found a radio near the river, then lost it to police. No report existed for that recovery, at least not under Hollis's name. Price asked the manager to locate the fisherman, and the manager gave a first name and a phone number. 2 days later, Price reached the fisherman and heard a nervous pause before any answer. The fisherman said he had found a handheld radio in Reeds sometime in early December of 2012. He claimed he called the number on it, and a man answered and told him to leave it alone. That part sounded strange, because those radios did not have call numbers like cell phones. When Price asked more, the fisherman admitted he never actually called. He just showed it to someone. He said a man in a pickup offered cash for it, and he took the cash, then regretted it later. Price did not treat that as a confession, but it was a new lead that fit the junction box detail. He requested old traffic camera logs for that stretch of access road near the complex. Most footage was gone, but a few still images remained for toll and speed enforcement. One image from that week showed a pickup parked near the west fence access lane. The plate was too blurred to read, yet the truck had a distinctive ladder rack. Price checked old maintenance work orders and found a contractor had serviced floodlights that month. The contractor's truck in the paperwork had a ladder rack. The name on the invoice was a small electrical firm that had since dissolved. Price ran the owner's name and found it tied to another investigation from years earlier. It involved theft from job sites and a pattern of selling company gear for cash. Price pulled the old interview with the electrician who replaced the flickering floodlight. That electrician had said the light shorted before, and he had replaced the head twice. Price asked a modern technician to inspect the current light circuit. They found evidence of repeated tampering in the conduit, with tool marks under the protective sleeve. It was not proof of a crime, but it suggested someone had been inside that line more than once. The case stayed frustrating until a different phone call landed on Price's desk. In late September of 2020, a hospital social worker called the police tip line. She said an older man had checked in, confused and dehydrated, and he kept repeating a name. The name was Hollis Crane, and the man insisted he was Hollis, despite missing teeth and heavy weight loss. The hospital could not confirm identity, but his fingerprints were taken as part of intake. Those prints matched the missing file, and the match was confirmed by a state lab technician. Price drove to the hospital and met the man in a quiet room with a nurse present. Hollis looked older than his age, and his hands trembled when he lifted a cup. He recognized his own name, but he struggled with dates and places. When Price asked about the warehouse, Hollis stared at the wall and said, "They said I was wrong." He then asked if his daughter was still in middle school, which made the nurse look down. Over several interviews, Hollis gave fragments that Price treated as witness statements, not perfect memory. He recalled walking to Building 2, then hearing his radio crackle with a voice he did not recognize. He said the voice told him the back door was open and that he needed to check inside. That instruction did not match the dispatch service, which never gave site-specific commands. Hollis said he stepped into the corridor and someone behind him shut the door hard. He remembered a bright light in his face and a chemical smell that made his throat burn. Then he remembered being in a vehicle, hearing river water, and feeling cold air through a broken window. After that, his memories became like short clips with missing sound. He remembered being told his name was different and that he had been caught stealing. He remembered paperwork on a table and a hand guiding his fingers to sign. Hollis said he refused, and the hand slapped him, then the room went dark again. Price did not accept every piece as literal, but the pattern sounded like coercion and control. The hospital ran toxicology, and traces suggested long-term exposure to sedatives, though not definitive. A doctor noted possible head trauma and suggested his memory could be fragmented by repeated injury. Price asked Hollis about the ladder rack truck, and Hollis flinched before answering. He said he remembered a metal clang, like a ladder shifting, and a voice that whistled on certain words. Price compared that with old recordings, including the dispatch call placed by Hollis at 10:30. The call was short, but Hollis's voice had a distinct cadence, with a slight nasal edge. The voice on the missed radio check recordings was not preserved, but the dispatch service kept notes. One note said a male voice answered the shack phone once, then hung up without speaking. That had been written off as a wrong number, but Price now treated it as a signal. Price worked backward from the corridor camera static and the junction box location. He believed someone cut the camera line briefly, then used the blind spot to move Hollis. The west fence led toward the river path where the fisherman found a radio. That radio was likely dropped or tossed during the move, then bought back by someone who wanted it gone. The ladder rack truck tied the event to a contractor with access and a reason to be there. The payoff came from something small, a property tax photo archived by the county. It showed the utility shed behind the lodge-like building, taken in 2013 for assessment. In the background, the old junction post was visible, and a cable loop hung lower than code required. Price enlarged the image and saw a strip of tape around the cable, the same bright pattern used by that contractor. The tape brand was common, but the pattern matched other job site photos in an unrelated theft file. Price located a former employee of the dissolved firm, and the man agreed to talk with legal counsel present. He said his boss used to brag about teaching people a lesson when they got in his way. He also said the boss kept a storage unit where he hid tools, radios, and uniforms from past jobs. A search warrant was requested based on the totality of evidence, and a judge signed it. In the unit, officers found old security shirts, a handheld radio shell, and a binder of fake ID templates. No single item proved the full story, but together they supported a clear, plausible chain. Hollis was likely taken during that 6-minute blind spot, moved along the west fence, and forced into a vehicle. He was kept under control, pushed into a false identity, and moved between transient locations for years. He resurfaced only after his health failed, and he wandered into a hospital without resources or support. The suspect was arrested on charges related to kidnapping and identity fraud, according to later court filings. Hollis's reunion with his family did not look like a movie ending, and witnesses described it as quiet. His daughter was an adult, and she approached him slowly, like he might vanish if touched. Hollis cried when he heard her voice, and he kept saying he was sorry, even when no apology was owed. Price watched from the doorway, thinking about how a tiny camera glitch hid a life for years. Some cases do not end with certainty, but this one ended with a name returned home. The stories. This tape explains the warning signs. The tape was logged into evidence on a Tuesday, and the label only said, "Warning signs, do not ignore." When people finally listened to it, a year of roadside deaths stopped looking random and started looking engineered. In late 2019, Dax Calder was 37 and worked as a county sign technician for Public Works. He spent most days replacing faded reflectors, straightening bent posts, and arguing with weathered bolts. That morning, he had one simple goal: confirm the new warning signs on a mountain bypass were correct. The bypass cut through pine forest and rocky slopes about 20 miles from a small river town. It was the kind of road locals used to avoid traffic, and tourists used when their GPS got stubborn. For months, there had been crash reports near mile marker 12, mostly at night and in clear weather. Dispatch logs described drivers swearing they followed the signs, right up until the road turned wrong. Dax parked his county truck by a gravel pull-off, then walked the shoulder with a clipboard. He counted chevrons, measured sign height, and checked that each post was seated firmly in packed dirt. Everything looked normal at first, and that bothered him more than anything strange ever could. If the road was dangerous, it should look dangerous, and it did not. The first warning sign was a standard yellow curve sign with an advisory speed. It was fresh, reflective, and aimed straight at the lane like it had been installed yesterday. Dax wrote down its placement, then stood behind it to check the bolts in the bracket. That was when he saw the backplate had a second set of holes, drilled clean and recent. He touched the metal and felt a faint grit, like someone had ground it and wiped it fast. County signs came from a warehouse, and nobody was supposed to drill new holes in the field. Dax took photos anyway, then noted the serial number stamped near the lower edge. The serial number did not match the shipment list he printed that morning. He drove farther and found the next sign, a narrow bridge warning near a shallow ravine. The bridge was not narrow, and the guardrails were modern and well-maintained. Dax checked his map and confirmed there was no bridge project scheduled for this road. He stared at the sign until his eyes started hunting for an explanation that was not there. A pickup came up behind him, slow and cautious, then stopped in the lane with hazards flashing. The driver rolled down the window and asked if the road was closed because the signs looked wrong. Dax said the road was open, and he asked what signs the driver had seen. The driver said, 2 detour arrows and a warning about a drop-off, and none of it made sense. Dax felt a tight heat in his chest because his clipboard showed no detour signs at all. He asked where the driver saw them, and the driver pointed back toward a turn he had already passed. Dax thanked him, then watched the pickup crawl away like the driver did not trust the pavement. When the truck disappeared, Dax walked to his county rig and called his supervisor. His supervisor was Renly Goss, early 50s, a practical manager who hated surprises. Renly answered on the second ring and sounded annoyed until Dax said, "Wrong signs," and "new drill holes." Renly told him to pull the signs if he could, and to document everything before touching anything. Dax agreed, then drove back toward the turn the pickup driver mentioned. The detour arrows were there, but they were not county issue, and they were not on proper posts. They were strapped to trees with metal banding angled to pull drivers toward a dirt service road. The service road dropped downhill into dense brush, then curved behind a ridge and disappeared. A small hand-painted board read "Bridge Out," and the letters looked fresh. Dax stood at the edge and watched a sedan approach, headlights bright in late afternoon shade. The driver slowed, saw the detour, and started to turn onto the service road without hesitation. Dax stepped into view and waved both arms, forcing the driver to stop hard. The driver rolled down the window and said, "The signs told me to go this way." Dax told the driver to stay on the paved bypass because the detour was not official. The driver looked embarrassed, then angry, and asked why the signs were there at all. Dax did not have an answer he could prove, so he said they were unauthorized and dangerous. The driver backed out carefully and left, and Dax felt his hands trembling afterward. He took photos of every arrow, every strap, and every bolt head. He also noticed something else. Each detour sign was placed just before a blind curve. Drivers had only a second to decide, and the detour looked like the safe choice. Dax recorded voice notes on his phone, then tried to send them, and the upload stalled. The bypass had patchy coverage, so he saved everything and drove to higher ground. From a ridge turnout, he finally got enough signal to send Renly a batch of photos. Renly called back immediately and told him to stop touching anything and wait for law enforcement. Dax said he would, but he did not like leaving the signs up even for an hour. A deputy arrived 40 minutes later, a lean woman named Tressa Mullaney, mid-30s. She listened, took her own photos, and called it in with a tone that turned serious fast. Tressa asked if Dax had seen anyone nearby, and Dax said only one pickup passing earlier. She nodded and said that matched witness statements from past crash calls. They removed the tree-strapped signs and loaded them into the deputy SUV. Under the painted board, they found a strip of reflective tape like a road crew used. Tressa said the county did not use that exact tape, and she sounded certain about it. Dax asked if this was connected to the crashes, and she said, "It looks like it could be." Renly told Dax to return to the yard and pull old installation records for the bypass. Dax spent the evening in a dusty office, flipping binders and scanning sign serial numbers. He found that 2 shipments had gone missing over the past year, both marked as minor losses. The lost notes said damaged in transit, which now felt like a lazy answer. The next day, Tressa met Dax in a small interview room at the sheriff office. She played him a clip from an archived 911 call from 2018. A shaken driver described a bridge-out sign and a detour that led into darkness. The driver said he turned back in time, and he kept repeating that the signs looked official. Tressa also had crash scene photos from 2018 and 2019. In each case, responders found tire tracks on the same service road leading to the ravine. Some vehicles rolled, some hit trees, and one went far enough that it was hard to locate. The official reports blamed driver error because no one could confirm the signs. Dax stared at the photos and realized why the signs were never in evidence. The signs did not stay up long, and nobody thought to collect them until too late. Tressa said a volunteer firefighter once mentioned hearing a power tool at night. The firefighter never reported it because the sound faded and nothing seemed wrong then. Now that detail mattered, and the deputy wrote it down with a grim look. Dax tried to think like a technician, not like a person getting spooked. He made a map of where the fake signs had been placed, using his photos and GPS stamps. A pattern showed up fast. Each cluster was near a spot where a vehicle could not easily turn around. If a driver committed to the detour, they were trapped by narrow cuts and loose gravel. Tressa asked if county staff could have installed them, even by accident. Dax said county crews would not strap signs to trees with banding because it broke policy. He also said the drilled sign backs meant someone had access to real county panels. That did not prove anything alone, but it narrowed the pool of people who could do it. Renly gave Dax a copy of the warehouse key log because he trusted Dax more than paperwork. The log was half digital and half scribbled, and it looked sloppier than it should have. Dax compared times to the missing shipments and saw repeated entries by the same initials. Those initials belonged to a contract yard worker who only handled loading and trash. The worker was named Cale Rydell, early 40s, hired through a staffing agency. Cale had access to the sign racks at night because he swept the yard and locked gates. That alone was not enough. But the timeline kept lining up in ways that felt too clean. Tressa asked for Cale's address, and Renly refused, saying it needed proper process. That is when the tape entered the story, quietly and almost by accident. A retired dispatcher called the sheriff office and said she had saved an odd recording. She said it was not a 911 call, it was a voicemail left on a county line. The voicemail was from a man who sounded calm, describing a warning system with pride. The cassette-style tape was old because the dispatcher kept personal backups in the 90s. She had transferred it to a digital file years later, but still called it a tape out of habit. Tressa brought the audio to Dax because the voice mentioned signs, bolts, and the bypass. Dax listened with headphones and felt his stomach drop within the first minute. The man on the recording said, "Those warnings are the whole thing. They guide them where you want." He talked about reflective angles and placement, like someone explaining a craft. He mentioned using real county panels, because drivers trusted official metal more than wood boards. He said the best trap was one that looked like safety, and he laughed softly after that. Tressa paused the audio and asked if Dax recognized the voice. Dax did not want to guess, but he said it sounded like someone he had heard on yard radios. Renly sometimes used a gravelly voice when he joked, but this was not Renly. Dax asked where the tape came from, and Tressa said it was dated 1998. That date made no sense at first because the bypass was not completed until 2003. Then Dax remembered something. The service road was older, and it used to serve a quarry site. Old county plans showed the area marked as restricted during blasting operations. Back then, there were warning signs, and the public learned to obey them without question. Tressa and Dax went to the county archive room. a basement space that smelled like damp cardboard. They pulled microfilm and dusty maps, and they found a file labeled Quarry Access Control. Inside were notes about repeated trespass incidents and stolen equipment. A line item mentioned Deterrent Signage Program, approved for night visibility. The author name was not Renly. It was a previous supervisor who retired long ago. That supervisor had a son who worked briefly at the county yard, then left under a cloud. Dax found the son's name in an old staffing roster, and it matched Cale Rydell's legal name. Cale had changed his last name later, and the archive files still carried the older one. Tressa ran it up the chain and got a warrant for Cale's phone and storage unit. The unit was across town, behind a row of auto shops, and it looked ordinary from outside. Inside, deputies found stacks of sign blanks, reflective sheeting, and a crate of banding straps. They also found a portable drill press and a set of county serial stamps. Cale did not deny making signs, but he claimed he was building props for a film project. Tressa asked why the props matched the crash locations and why they used county serial formats. Cale shrugged and said people drove too fast, and they would crash anywhere. Then he said something that matched the tape, almost word for word. He said, if they see a warning, they do what the warning says. That line hit the room like a cold slap because it was not a defense. It was a philosophy, and it sounded practiced, like he had repeated it for years. The payoff came when they compared the tape voice to a recorded jail call. The sheriff office had legal access to that call, and a voice analyst reported a strong match. It was not perfect science, but combined with the tools and the signs, it added weight. Tressa also found that Cale's father had been the quarry security contractor in 1998. That meant the tape was likely the father teaching the son, or the son learning early. Either way, it explained how the method existed before the bypass ever did. When the quarry shut down, the service road stayed, and the idea stayed with it. Then the bypass opened, and the trap finally had traffic. The case did not solve every crash with absolute certainty, and nobody promised it would. Some drivers were drunk, some were tired, and some made bad choices with no help from signs. Still, witness statements changed after the arrest because people finally trusted their own memory. Several said they saw a man at night moving calmly with a flashlight near the trees. The county replaced every warning sign on that stretch, using locked hardware and tracked serial scans. They also blocked the service road with boulders and steel posts, leaving only a narrow footpath. Dispatch logs showed a sharp drop in late-night crashes within weeks. The bypass became boring again, which was the best possible outcome. Dax kept a copy of the tape transcript in his work folder, even after the trial ended. He did not listen to it anymore, because the laughter at the end stuck in his head. He only remembered the lesson. Signs were supposed to protect people, not steer them into danger. When he bolted a warning sign to a post, he checked it twice, then checked it again. The stories. The final body cam clip from a night patrol. The final body cam clip lasts 47 seconds, and it ends with a calm voice saying, "Copy, I see it now." That line was never meant to be public, and it was almost erased from the record. Tamsin Crow was 32, and she worked nights as a deputy in a rural county with long, empty roads. She liked the shift because it stayed predictable, and predictable meant everyone usually went home. On a cold week in late fall, she had one simple goal for that night: finish reports early. Her partner was supposed to ride along, but he called out sick right before briefing ended. The county seat was a small place with one diner, one gas station, and a river that cut through scrubland. Dispatch warned about deer strikes, then mentioned a broken gate near an old service road by the water. It sounded like nothing, but the service road led to a fenced maintenance yard with county equipment. Tamsin said, "I will check it," and rolled out with her heater rattling and her body cam blinking. She reached the gate a little after midnight, and her headlights washed over a chain hanging loose. The padlock was still there, but the shackle looked twisted, as if someone forced it open. Tamsin stepped out, clicked on her flashlight, and called the yard number on her radio. Dispatch answered fast and said the yard supervisor was not on call tonight and nobody should be inside. The place smelled like wet dirt and diesel, and the gravel made her footsteps too loud. She walked the fence line, then saw fresh tire tracks that cut in from the road and turned deep inside. They were not county truck treads, and they looked narrower, like a private pickup with worn tires. Tamsin raised her light, and her beam landed on a portable fuel tank sitting near a shed door. That tank was supposed to be chained, and she knew that because she had been here last month. She checked the latch, then noticed the shed door was not shut all the way, just resting. A low clicking sound came from inside, like a cheap plastic switch being tapped over and over. Tamsin called out, "County Sheriff, come out now!" And her voice sounded steady in her own ears. Nobody answered, but the clicking stopped, and the air seemed to hold still for a moment. Then her radio popped with a soft burst of static, and dispatch asked if she had said something. Tamsin said she was checking a possible break-in, and dispatch told her to stay safe. She took one step closer, pushed the door open with her boot, and the smell inside hit hard. There was a sharp chemical scent mixed with old oil, like someone spilled cleaner on a mechanic floor. Her flashlight found shelving, spare cones, and a desk with papers scattered like they were swept aside. On the desk sat a small handheld radio, turned on with its volume knob twisted to a harsh level. The clicking sound had been its scan button, and somebody had been listening for her approach. Tamsin backed out, and she did not try to be brave about it. She just got distance. She moved to cover behind a loader tire, and she told dispatch to send a second unit. Dispatch said the nearest unit was 20 minutes out because a crash call tied up the highway crew. Tamsin said, "I will hold and watch," and she kept her eyes on the shed door. A minute later, a vehicle started somewhere deeper in the yard, and its engine turned over twice. Headlights came on behind a stack of culvert pipes, then shut off again like the driver reconsidered. Tamsin angled her body cam toward the sound, and she whispered, "I hear a vehicle moving." Dispatch asked for a description, and she said she could not see it clearly yet. The yard was quiet again, but her gut told her somebody was watching her from the dark. She scanned the fence line and noticed a section where weeds were flattened in a clean path. It looked like someone had crossed there more than once, and it led down toward the riverbank. Tamsin thought about the fuel tank, the radio, and the tire tracks, and she chose the river path. She moved slow and kept her light low, and the camera caught more shadow than detail. At the river edge, she found a small aluminum skiff pulled into the reeds, still wet on the seats. A coil of rope lay inside, and a waterproof case sat open, with foam cutouts for electronics. That case was the kind search teams used, but the sticker on it was peeled away on purpose. Tamsin took out her phone, snapped photos, and spoke the time out loud for the recording. Her radio crackled again, and this time the voice was not dispatch, it was a deputy voice. It said, "All units, stand down on the yard, false alarm," and it used the right channel. Tamsin froze because the voice sounded like Dorian Pike, a day shift deputy she barely knew. She keyed up and said, "Dispatch, confirm that order," and she waited for the answer. Dispatch came back, tense and careful, and said they did not give that order. Tamsin said someone was impersonating an officer on the channel, and dispatch told her to pull back. She looked toward the yard, and she saw a faint moving light, like a phone screen bobbing. Her body cam caught it for a second, then it vanished behind the fence posts. Tamsin returned to her cruiser, locked herself inside, and started writing notes while she waited. She made a timeline: the broken lock, the shed radio, the skiff, and the fake radio call. She also searched the prior calls for this yard and found 2 similar complaints over the past month. Both were closed as unfounded, and both were signed off by the same supervisor name in the log. That name was not a deputy. It was a county facilities manager named Lennox Harrow. When the backup unit finally arrived, it was not another deputy. It was a state trooper from the highway. His name was Cale Vinter, and he was 39, and he looked annoyed about being pulled off traffic. Tamsin showed him the lock and the shed, and she played the radio recording on her cruiser system. Cale listened, then said, "That is not dispatch," and he stared into the dark like he wanted it to blink. They cleared the shed together and found the handheld radio gone along with the scattered papers. The papers were not gone completely though, and one corner stayed pinned under a coffee mug ring. Tamsin lifted it with gloves and saw an equipment transfer form with a date from 2011. It listed a confiscated boat motor, a fuel drum, and a storage location at the county yard. The signature line was smeared, but the printed name was Lennox Harrow, the facilities manager. Cale said he had never seen a facilities manager sign evidence forms, and that made both of them quiet. In the next hour, they walked the riverbank and found footprints leading to the skiff, then into water. They also found a second set of tracks, heavier and more deliberate, like boots meant for wading. The skiff was still there, but the rope was cut clean, and the cut end had fresh fibers. Tamsin photographed the cut, then bagged a small piece of rope that snagged on a reed. Kale said they should request a forensics team, and dispatch said the team would come at daylight. Tamsin went back to the station before sunrise, and she kept her body cam on for every step. She sat at a computer, pulled archived incident reports, and searched Lennox Harrow's name carefully. She found a civil complaint from 2012 about missing impound items, dismissed for lack of proof. She found a memo about unauthorized overtime, and another about keys not being returned after a project. None of it proved anything, but it formed a pattern that made the yard feel less random. She also checked the radio impersonation angle because that was the part that bothered her most. The voice that sounded like Dorian Pike had used the right code words, but the cadence was off. Tamsin asked dispatch for the recording, and dispatch sent a copy through the internal system. Tamsin listened with headphones, and she heard a faint second sound behind the voice, a mechanical tick. It matched the scan button rhythm she heard earlier, like the same device was near the speaker. At noon, she approached Dorian Pike at the station, careful to keep it casual and non-accusing. Dorian was in uniform, healthy, and clearly not sick, and he asked why she looked tired. Tamsin said someone used his voice on the radio last night, and she watched his eyes closely. He looked surprised, then defensive, and said, "That is not funny. Who said that?" Tamsin said she had the recording, and Dorian asked to hear it, then went pale when it played. Dorian said he was home asleep, and his phone location history backed that up without much effort. He also said his department-issued radio was missing last week for a day, then returned to his locker. He thought it was a prank, and he did not report it because he did not want trouble. Tamsin wrote that down, then asked who had access to lockers during maintenance. Dorian said facility staff sometimes entered the area for repairs, and he mentioned Lennox Harrow by name. The daylight forensics team arrived at the yard, but the scene had already cooled and dried. They found partial prints on the shed door, and they lifted a palm smear from the desk edge. They also found a single hair caught on a nail by the shed, and they collected it without comment. The rope fiber matched commercial marine rope, common and not traceable without more context. Still, the tech noted the rope was cut with a clean blade, not torn by strain. That evening, Tamsin reviewed her own body cam from the river, and she saw something she missed. In one frame, when her light swept the reeds, a reflective strip flashed, then vanished again. It looked like safety tape, the kind used on work jackets, not on fishing gear. County facilities workers wore jackets like that during night callouts, especially in cold weather. Tamsin marked the time code, then pulled the yard roster for who had keys after hours. The key sign outlog was thin, almost too neat, and it showed one entry for that night. It listed Lennox Harrow taking keys for an equipment check, then returning them before midnight. That entry did not match what Tamsin saw, because the activity happened well after midnight. When she asked the desk sergeant about the log, he shrugged and said the county ran its own system. That answer felt like a wall, and she could tell the wall was not made of paperwork. Tamsin decided to interview the yard supervisor anyway, a gravel-voiced man named Orson Ked. Orson was 50, worked maintenance for decades, and spoke like every word cost him time. He said Lennox was always around, and he said Lennox knew how to move gear without leaving paperwork. Orson also said a county boat motor went missing years ago, and Lennox blamed teenagers for it. When Tamsin asked about the skiff, Orson said there should not be any boats stored there at all. That night, Tamsin returned to the yard with Cale Vinter, and this time they parked farther away. They did not announce themselves on the radio, and they used a separate encrypted channel to coordinate. They watched from a low hill, and they waited past midnight, letting the cold settle into their gloves. Around 1, a county pickup rolled in, slow lights off, and stopped at the broken gate. A man stepped out wearing a reflective work jacket, and he carried bolt cutters in his left hand. Cale filmed through binoculars, and Tamsin kept her body cam aimed steady from the shadow. The man opened the gate like he owned it, then drove inside and shut it behind him. He went straight to the shed, and a small light flickered within, then snapped off again. A minute later, the man walked toward the river path, carrying the same waterproof case. Tamsin and Cale moved, staying low, and they followed at a distance that kept them unseen. At the reeds, the man knelt by the skiff, and he lifted the floor panel like he knew the latch. He pulled out a compact radio scanner and a second handheld police radio with its antenna removed. He placed them in the case, then reached for the rope, but paused as if he heard something. Tamsin stepped forward, lit him up with her flashlight, and said, "Hands where I can see them." The man flinched, then tried to smile, and the smile did not reach his eyes. It was Lennox Harrow, mid-40s, clean-shaven, and wearing county patches on his sleeves. He said, "This is a misunderstanding," and he glanced toward the water like he hoped it could help. Cale came in from the side, identified himself, and ordered Lennox to the ground. Lennox hesitated, then complied, but his hands trembled the way guilty hands often did. Tamsin cuffed him, then asked why he had a police radio and why he mimicked a deputy voice. Lennox said he found the radio in the shed weeks ago, and he claimed he kept it for safety. Tamsin did not argue. She just asked what was inside the skiff and why it was hidden. Lennox said it was county property, and he said he was moving it to prevent theft. Cale opened the case, and the contents told a different story, including a seal bag with cash inside. There was also a small hard drive labeled with tape and marked with a date in 2011. They brought Lennox to the station, and they logged the items as evidence under Cale's authority. The hard drive was sent to a regional tech unit because local staff did not have the tools. 2 days later, the tech unit reported that the drive held scanned forms and audio recordings. The recordings were dispatch channel captures, and some were cut together to imitate deputy voices. One file was labeled with Dorian Pike's name, and it contained voice samples from roll call chatter. It looked like Lennox had been building a toolkit to control the radio traffic when needed. The scanned forms on the drive showed equipment marked as destroyed, then reappearing as transfers. Some items were small, like fuel cards and radios, but others were bigger, like motors and generators. The pattern suggested a slow theft ring, where county gear vanished and then got sold off quietly. That could explain the skiff and the rope and the late-night trips to the river. What it did not explain was the title line from Tamsin's final body cam clip, "Copy. I see it now." Tamsin did not understand that line either until the captain called her into his office. He told her the county attorney wanted the case kept tight, and he warned her about publicity. Tamsin asked about the final clip and why the station archive showed her body cam ended early. The captain avoided her eyes, then said the upload had a corruption issue during transfer. Tamsin knew that was weak, because body cam files had checksums and redundancy, and corruption was logged. She went back to the evidence room, and she requested the original body cam card under protocol. The technician on duty, a careful woman named Briar Sloan, said the card was missing from the sleeve. Briar said it came in, then it was pulled for review, and the request line was signed by command. Tamsin asked who reviewed it, and Briar said she could not say, but her face showed she hated it. Tamsin left, then sat in her cruiser, and she listened to the copy she saved on her own system. Tamsin had made a habit of exporting her own clips to include with reports, which was allowed at the time. Her exported file was not perfect, but it captured audio clearly, including the last 47 seconds. In that clip, after she cuffed Lennox, a second voice came over the radio, low and confident. It said, "Bring the case to the south lot, do not book it," and it used a supervisor call sign. Tamsin replied without thinking, "Copy, I see it now," because she saw headlights approaching from the south lot. Those headlights belonged to a command SUV, not a patrol unit, and it arrived within minutes. A supervisor stepped out, not the captain, but a lieutenant who handled county contracts and budgets. His name was Stellan Ward, and he told Tamsin to turn Lennox over and let the county handle it. In the clip, Tamsin asked if Lennox was being arrested, and Stellan said, "He is not going downtown." Cale Vinter challenged him, and Stellan said the state trooper had no jurisdiction on county property. The argument was clipped, but the tension in their voices was clear, and it explained the missing footage. Tamsin realized the final clip was not about Lennox getting caught, it was about who arrived to stop it. If that clip went public, it would raise questions about why command tried to intercept evidence. It would also connect county theft to someone with authority, or at least to someone protecting it. Tamsin brought the clip to Cale because the state trooper system had its own chain of custody. Cale listened, jaw tight, then said, "This is why they wanted me gone that first night." Cale filed a formal report to his agency, and he attached Tamsin's export as supporting material. He also requested an outside investigation, and he did it through channels above the county level. Within a week, auditors arrived, and county offices got nervous, and keys started changing hands. The county attorney issued a statement about administrative review, and the captain kept avoiding questions. Lennox Harrow remained in custody on state charges tied to the cash and the stolen radios. But the larger case widened because the hard drive showed more names and more unexplained transfers. Months later, Tamsin learned that Stellan Ward resigned quietly, citing health and family reasons. No public hearing happened, and the county settled several civil claims without admitting wrongdoing. The yard got new locks, new cameras, and new rules for after-hours access. Dispatch also updated radio procedures, and they tightened encryption on secondary channels. Dorian Pike got his reputation back, but he never stopped looking over his shoulder on night calls. Tamsin stayed on nights, and she kept her routine simple because simple kept her sharp. She did not talk about the case much, even when people tried to pry at the edges of it. When asked, she said the truth in a plain way, that one person got caught and others got exposed. She also said the scariest part was not the yard or the river or the dark. The scariest part was hearing a supervisor voice on the radio and realizing it did not mean safety. The final body cam clip still exists because Tamsin kept her export and Cale logged his own copy. It is short and calm, and it does not show anything dramatic, just headlights and a decision point. It ends with Tamsin saying, "Copy, I see it now," and then the file cuts to silence. Some nights, she thought about how close that silence came to swallowing the whole story. Then she checked her gear, started her cruiser, and drove the same roads with her eyes open. The stories. The bus driver who turned back years later. The route ended early, and the radio kept talking after the bus went silent. Years later, the same driver returned to the last stop and found out why. Dorian Klein was 44 and worked weekday mornings for a regional transit contractor. He drove a long commuter loop through timber towns, then back toward the highway. That Tuesday started like any other, with coffee in a paper cup and a schedule clipped to plastic. He planned to finish the loop, fuel up, and be home before dark. The town was small enough that Dorian recognized most riders by their shoes. A nurse with squeaky clogs, a mill worker with orange earplugs, a student with a sketchbook. They nodded at him like he was part of the scenery, which he liked. The bus was old, but it ran, and the heater worked. His biggest worry that morning was a fog bank near the river bridge. Dispatch called him once to confirm a detour around a washout, and he read it back cleanly. The road was narrow, with tall firs and no shoulder in spots. Dorian kept both hands steady and watched for deer, then for loose gravel. The bus climbed into higher ground where cell service dropped to nothing. He passed the last convenience store and felt that familiar quiet settle in. At 11:30, he reached the turnaround near an abandoned rest area. It was a patch of cracked asphalt, a closed bathroom building, and a picnic table that leaned sideways. The map called it a stop, but nobody used it anymore. It existed for the timetable, not for people. Dorian opened the doors out of habit, waited 10 seconds, then closed them again. That was when he saw the backpack in the aisle, sitting upright like someone had placed it carefully. It was a plain gray bag, not one he recognized from earlier. Dorian checked the mirrors, then looked at his passenger count sheet. The bus was empty. And it had been empty since the last drop-off by the mill gate. He remembered the last rider getting off, because the kid thanked him twice. Dorian walked back and touched the backpack with 2 fingers, like it might be hot. It was heavier than it looked, and something inside clinked softly. He set it on the front seat, then keyed the radio. He told dispatch there was a lost bag and asked if anyone had called in. Dispatch said nobody had reported anything yet and told him to bring it to the depot. He should have just turned around, but he noticed a smell when he lifted it again. It was sharp, like pool cleaner, mixed with something sweet and wrong. Dorian hesitated, then unzipped the top a few inches. Inside was a plastic bottle with a rag stuffed into the neck and a second bottle taped to it. There were also matchbooks and a folded paper with a hand-drawn diagram. Dorian zipped it shut fast, and his throat went dry. He backed away and stared at the bag like it could move. He keyed the radio again, and this time his voice came out thin. He told dispatch the bag looked dangerous, and he needed instructions right now. Dispatch asked what kind of dangerous, and Dorian said he did not want to describe it over an open channel. Dispatch told him to pull off the route and wait for law enforcement. Dorian said there was nowhere safe to pull off, and the rest area was closed. Dispatch told him to stay put, doors locked, and keep the radio open. Dorian did what he was told and tried not to look at the backpack. He turned off the engine to save fuel, then turned it back on because the quiet made his ears ring. Fog rolled between the trees, and the rest area sign creaked in the wind. He watched the road in the mirror, expecting headlights, but the road stayed empty. After 10 minutes, the radio crackled, then went dead for a moment. Dorian thought he heard someone breathing on the line, then a click, then silence again. He pressed the talk button and asked dispatch to confirm. Dispatch answered, but the reply sounded delayed, like the words were coming through water. A car appeared from the trees, not on the road, but in the gravel lot behind the closed bathrooms. Dorian had not heard it arrive. It was an older sedan with no front plate, and its paint looked dull, almost dusty. A person stepped out, hood up, hands in pockets, walking slow toward the bus. Dorian locked the doors again, even though they were already locked. He picked up the radio mic and told dispatch someone was approaching the bus from the rear lot. Dispatch told him to stay inside and asked for a description. Dorian said the person looked average height, bulky jacket, face not visible. The person kept coming, and Dorian felt his heartbeat in his fingertips. The person reached the side of the bus and knocked once, then twice, polite and steady. Dorian did not answer, and the person knocked again, then pressed their forehead to the glass. Dorian could not see eyes under the hood, only a shadow and the outline of a nose. The person pointed at the backpack on the front seat, then made a slow, twisting motion with their hand, like turning a key. Dorian shook his head hard, then mouthed no, and backed away. The person tapped the glass and pointed again, more urgent. Then they stepped away, walked to the front of the bus, and crouched near the wheel well. Dorian lost sight of them, and panic spread through him like heat. He told dispatch the person was at the front of the bus, and then the engine coughed. The dashboard lights flickered, and the bus shuddered as if someone had tugged a cable. Dorian reached for the door switch to force the doors open, thinking he might run, but the switch did nothing. He tried the emergency lever, and it stuck halfway. The bus horn blared once without his hands on it, loud and sudden, then went quiet. Dorian heard a metallic scrape under the floor, near the front axle. He grabbed the fire extinguisher and held it like a bat. He kept his eyes on the windshield, waiting for the hooded person to reappear. Instead, he saw the sedan roll slowly into view, now on the road, moving away. The hooded person was behind the wheel, and the car picked up speed as it disappeared into fog. The bus sat there, trembling, and Dorian realized the backpack was still on the seat. He also realized dispatch had stopped talking. He pressed the mic and shouted, asking if anyone was on the line. The radio gave only a hiss, then a broken fragment of speech, like a recording clipped mid-sentence. Dorian sat down hard and tried to breathe through his nose. He stared at the backpack and wondered if the person had tried to disable the bus to get it back. A state trooper arrived almost 40 minutes later, lights flashing through the fog. Another unit came behind, and then a county deputy. Dorian watched them approach with caution, hands visible, weapons low, but ready. They ordered him out, moved him away from the bus, and asked him to sit on the asphalt with his hands on his knees. His legs shook so badly he could not stand straight. The trooper entered the bus with gloves on and carried the backpack out like it was alive. The deputy asked Dorian to repeat everything, and Dorian did, word by word. He told them about the smell, the diagram, the hooded person, the strange radio delay. He told them he had not touched anything after the first unzip. The deputy nodded, but his eyes stayed flat. They shut the road down for hours and brought in a specialist from another county. Dorian saw them place the backpack in a thick container and load it into a truck. They never told him exactly what it was, only that he did the right thing. The rest area stayed closed, and his route was canceled for the day. Dorian went home and sat in his kitchen until dawn, still hearing the knock in his head. He returned to work 2 days later, then quit before the month ended. He told people he could not handle the mountain roads anymore, and that was mostly true. He found a job as a freight dispatcher, where the worst thing that happened was a missed pickup. The bus company replaced him, and the route kept running, but Dorian avoided that highway like it was cursed. Time did what it always does, and the story turned into a rumor. Some people claimed it was a bomb, others said it was drugs, others said it was nothing. Dorian never corrected anyone because he did not have proof, only memory. He tried to file an information request once, but the response came back thin and redacted. After a while, he stopped trying. In the summer of 2023, Dorian got a letter with the county seal on it. It was brief and careful, inviting him to speak with an investigator about the old incident. The name on the letter was not a detective name, but an analyst, someone who worked cold files and archived records. Dorian almost threw it away, but curiosity won. The meeting took place in a plain office behind the courthouse with bad carpet and fluorescent lights. The analyst was a woman in her 50s named Maris Velton. She had wireframe glasses and a calm voice that never rose. She did not act like someone chasing headlines, more like someone cleaning up an old mess. Maris asked Dorian to tell the story again, and he did. She listened without interrupting, writing notes in neat block letters. When he finished, she nodded once and slid a folder across the table. Inside were photocopies of dispatch logs, a grainy still frame from a bus camera, and a map printout with circles drawn in pen. Dorian looked at the still frame first, and his stomach tightened. It showed the hooded person by the glass, head tilted, finger pointing toward the front seat. The camera timestamp read 11:37, and the image was clearer than Dorian expected. The person wore gloves, and the hood shadowed the face, but the shape of the jacket was distinct. Dorian recognized the bulk at the shoulders, like thick padding. Maris tapped the dispatch logs with her finger and said the radio delay was real. The audio had been recorded at the dispatch center, and the waveform showed dropouts. The recording also contained an odd segment, a brief voice that was not dispatch. It sounded like a man, speaking low, saying, "Turn the key and come back." Dorian felt his skin prickle because that was the exact gesture the hooded person made. He asked Maris who said it, and she said they did not know. The channel was supposed to be secure, but on that stretch, it could be reached by a strong enough handheld. Maris said the voice might have been close to the bus, using the terrain to push signal. Maris then showed him the map and asked if he had ever looked behind the rest area bathrooms. Dorian said he saw the sedan back there and nothing else. Maris said deputies searched the area that day, but their search was limited by fog and time. She said a new search had been done recently, after a forestry crew found something odd during brush clearing. Dorian asked what they found, and Maris paused before answering. She said they found a shallow cache, wrapped in tarp, buried under old gravel. Inside were several items, including bus schedules, matchbooks, and a set of gloves with rubberized palms. There was also a small notebook with a hand-drawn diagram that matched Dorian's description. Dorian swallowed and asked why this was coming up now. Maris said the notebook included dates and route numbers that continued beyond the day Dorian stopped driving. It looked like planning for later attempts that never happened. Maris said the person might have been practicing or waiting for a better opportunity. The sudden stop may have forced them to abandon the cache. Dorian asked if they ever identified the person, and Maris said they had a lead, but it was incomplete. She said a traffic camera on the highway caught the sedan later that day, but the plate was unreadable. However, a repair shop invoice had surfaced years later, connected to a similar car with a cracked headlight. The customer used cash and a false name, but the shop kept a copy of a handwritten note. Maris slid another photocopy across the table. It was a short note, written in sloppy print, asking for a quick fix and a return pickup at the old rest area. At the bottom was a signature that looked like two initials, then a last name. Dorian stared at it and felt a strange jolt of recognition, like seeing a face in a crowd. He told Maris the last name matched the mill gate where he dropped off the last rider that morning. The mill had a security desk, and Dorian remembered the guard's name tag because it was unusual. The name on the note was the same. Dorian's mouth went dry as he said it out loud. Maris nodded, like she had been waiting for that connection. She said the old mill had kept shift rosters, and one guard with that last name had worked there briefly. The guard left after a complaint about erratic behavior and missing tools. The guard also lived near the bus route in a rural rental with a shed. Years later, the guard died in an accident and the property was sold. Dorian asked if they searched the shed, and Maris said they did, after getting permission from the new owner. She said they found nothing dramatic, but they did find a box of old transit tokens and a handheld radio with a modified antenna. They also found a jacket with padded shoulders, and the fabric matched the camera still. Maris said it was not enough for a case, but it was enough to answer questions. Dorian sat back and tried to process it, because the fear had never had a shape before. He asked why the person wanted the backpack back so badly. Maris said the evidence suggested it was not meant to be used on the bus itself. It was meant to be carried off at a later stop, possibly handed to someone else. The rest area was a meeting point, not a target. Maris said the diagram showed fuel storage locations, not inside the bus, but near a maintenance yard. It looked like sabotage planning aimed at equipment, not people. That mattered, but it did not make Dorian feel better. Dorian said the person still tried to trap him, and Maris agreed. She said the person likely panicked when the bag was discovered early and tried to recover it at any cost. Dorian asked about the strange moment with the horn and the door switch. Maris said technicians inspected the bus afterward and found the battery cable had been pulled loose. She said it could have been vibration, but it was unlikely. The scrape Dorian heard matched the position where someone could reach under and yank it. The horn could have triggered as voltage dropped, like a dying gasp. Dorian's hands started shaking again, and he clasped them tightly. He asked why the person drove away instead of fighting harder. Maris said the arriving patrol units were seen by the sedan driver before they reached the rest area. A watcher could have been posted down the road, or the driver could have heard sirens echo. The safest choice was to flee and leave the cash for later. Dorian stared at the bus camera still again and noticed something he never saw before. The hooded person's glove had a tear at the thumb, and a strip of pale skin showed. Dorian remembered that the mill guard with the unusual name had a bandage on his thumb once, back when Dorian still drove that route. Dorian could not be sure it was the same person, but the memory hit like cold water. Maris asked Dorian why he came back to this now, after so many years. Dorian said he did not choose it, the letter did. Maris said he did choose it because he walked into the office. Dorian looked at her and gave a small, tired smile. He told Maris the truth, which was that the unfinished part had followed him for years. It was not the backpack, or the fog, or even the knock. It was the moment the radio seemed to breathe, like someone was already inside the line. He said it made him feel watched in a way he could not explain. Maris said sometimes the mind saves the sharpest details, because they matter. Before Dorian left, Maris asked if he wanted to see the rest area again. Dorian surprised himself by saying yes, but not alone. 2 days later, Maris and a deputy met him at the old turnout in clear weather. The bathrooms were still boarded, and weeds pushed through the asphalt cracks. The place looked smaller than it did in memory. They walked behind the building where the sedan had been, and the deputy pointed to a patch of disturbed gravel. Dorian saw the shallow pit where the cache had been, now filled in again. He looked at the trees and listened to the wind, waiting for a knock that did not come. In daylight, it felt like any abandoned place, lonely and ordinary. Maris showed him the exact spot where the bus had parked, marked by a faded paint line. She asked him to stand there and look at the road, and Dorian did. He imagined the hooded figure, the radio hiss, the dead channel. He imagined the moment he chose to unzip the bag and the moment he chose to zip it back up. Dorian realized that small choices were the whole story. If he had ignored the bag, it might have been carried off later. If he had opened it fully, something could have spilled or sparked. If he had opened the doors to speak with the hooded person, the person might have gotten inside. The route could have ended in a different kind of silence. The deputy told Dorian they were closing the old file as far as they could. They had a likely suspect, but no living person to charge, and no clear proof of an intended crime. The evidence would be preserved, and the maintenance yards had new security measures now. Dorian nodded, because that was as close to an ending as reality often gave. On the drive back, Dorian watched the trees slide past and felt his shoulders relax for the first time in years. The fear did not vanish, but it shrank into something he could carry without dropping everything else. He had come back, and the place did not swallow him. He had faced the last stop, and it stayed quiet. That night, Dorian slept with the window cracked, and the cold air felt clean. He still dreamed of the knock sometimes, but now the dream had edges. It was no longer a faceless force in fog, it was a person making desperate choices. Dorian did not forgive that person, but he finally understood the shape of it. The next morning, Dorian drove to work in his own car and merged onto the highway without flinching. He watched a city bus pull into a stop and open its doors, ordinary and loud. For a moment, he imagined the driver inside, doing the job, trusting the schedule, trusting the radio. Dorian hoped that driver never had to turn back years later, just to learn why.